I would like to invite Rena DeGrazia, the Vice President of Financial Education at TD Canada Trust, to the stage to introduce our first panel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at my very first ABLE conference, and at TD, we're so proud to be an event sponsor. And it's really my pleasure to introduce this morning's plenary session on household financial health. The U.S. Financial Diaries track the financial lives of 235 low and moderate income households over the course of a year, documenting emerging challenges to the financial well-being of 40% of American families. And I have to tell you, these findings were quite compelling to us at TD and really actually served as a catalyst for us. It highlighted the need for similar research in Canada, and thus, by some gentle prodding from Prosper, we commissioned in 2017 the Pervasive and Profound study, which validated that many of the issues plaguing the financial well-being of Americans were actually also impacting Canadians in very similar ways. And so, understanding the importance of this issue, we're incredibly fortunate to have Rachel Schneider, co-author of the U.S. Financial Diaries, with us to share her insights and reflect with her fellow panelists on how we understand and improve financial well-being for all Canadians. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for this morning's session, Elodie Young, Director of Impact and Innovation at Prosper Canada.
Thank you so much, Rena, and I'm actually going to call Rachel to the stage right away. She's going to give us a talk about the fantastic research she's done on the Financial Diaries. So Rachel Schneider is the co-author of the Financial Diaries and Omidyar Network Entrepreneur in Residence at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. You can view Rachel's full bio on the ABLE website conference page, or the SCED website on sced.com. And following her address, Jerry Buckland, professor at Menno Simmons College, and Judy Duncan, executive director and head organizer at Acorn Canada, will join me and Rachel on stage for a panel discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for having me and giving me an excuse to come to Canada. It's just lovely here, and I'm really glad that we're going to have a chance to talk about how our findings from the U.S. Financial Diaries may or may not be similar to what's happening in Canada. And I'm really glad you're already in a game kind of mood. The bingo game was super fun. It got us going in the right place. So I'm going to ask you about another game, which is the game of life. Has anybody here played the game of life? Yes? Okay, good. Good. Then, the game of life is super ridiculous, really, when you think about it. You have this board, right, and it kind of curves around. This path curves around on a board. You have this little plastic car, which you move from block to block to block. And what my kids love about it is the spinny dial. Like, that's really the fun part. It tells you how many steps forward to move. Sometimes you get a card that tells you to do something silly, can make your family laugh. The game of life is a game about your financial life. And what's really kind of amazing about the game of life is you actually only make 3 decisions in the game of life. You decide whether you're going to go straight to work or go to college. You decide whether you're going to buy a house or rent and how many houses you're going to buy. That's always my son's favorite part. He likes imagining the beach house or the mansion. And you decide whether or not to have kids and how many kids to have. You roll a dice. And there are a few ridiculous things about this game, or things that the game gets completely wrong about our actual financial lives. So for one thing, you actually get more money when you have more children, which we know is not true, right? Not true. Oh, thank you. So you get more money if you have more children. You also everybody at the end of the game wins, has more money at the end than they had at the beginning. It's a game of mobility, and it's a game of retirement savings. And it manages to make retirement savings seem fun, because whoever has the most at the end of the game, the most for retirement, is the winner. But everybody starts with more, or everybody ends with more than they started with. And as part of the U.S. Financial Diary, and this idea, like, it sounds silly, right? I'm talking about this board game of life, but this idea that everybody ends with more than they started with is a really deep idea in economics, and an idea that comes up over and over again. Economists call it the life cycle arc. And Franco Modigliani got a Nobel Prize in economics for articulating how the life cycle arc affects people's savings. And a lot of our policies and programs are designed assuming that people live on this life cycle arc, where they start with getting an education, they get a job, they get a better job, they earn more over time, they have more at the end. But in the life cycle arc, like, if that's how you live, what matters most is slow and steady savings. So I am living on the life cycle arc. My life is following that pattern so far. And so what matters most for me is, can I be disciplined about my long-term goals relative to what I'm spending today? Right? And a lot of financial advice that helps me do that is valuable and useful. But for lots of people, they don't live on that life cycle arc. And we got a chance to go much deeper and understand what life looks like if it's not on that arc through the Financial Diaries study. So at the time, I was working at a nonprofit called CFSI, and you're going to meet Eliza Gutman later in this conference, who works there still. And my co-author, Jonathan Mordock, is still at the Financial Access Initiative at NYU. And with the support of the Ford Foundation, the Citi Foundation, and the Omidyar Network, we were able to do a very deep dive into the financial lives of American households. So as Rena said, we worked with 235 families. And if you don't know the US, like, what this map is telling you is we worked with rural families in the South. We worked with families who lived in big cities like Brooklyn in New York. We worked with families in smaller cities in Ohio and Kentucky, and in suburbs outside of those cities. We worked with families who were immigrants and families who had been in the US for generations. We worked with people of all different ethnicities, and we tried to understand what their financial lives looked like. And the way we did that is that we had field researchers who went to visit them every few weeks and gathered information in person about their financial lives. And we did that for a full year. And what it allows you to do is really get behind the snapshot of usual surveys, because we could see the movement over the course of a year, and you could get behind the kind of happy picture you might get in a particular day to, like, what's really going on behind the scenes. And for the most part, what people like and value about this work is the stories of people, because they bring these economic concepts very much to life. So I'm going to start by telling you the story of a couple named Becky and Jeremy. They live in Ohio. They have 3 kids. They have what from the outside looks like a very pleasant middle-class life. They own a house. They have 2 cars. Jeremy works full-time. Becky supplements their income with some part-time work. But on the day that my co-author, Jonathan, was meeting with them, Becky was in a really bad mood. And Jonathan asked her why. It's a gorgeous day, everything seems fine, why? And she said, I don't know whether or not to pay my mortgage. I hate having that bill hanging over my head. It's driving me crazy. It's not due for 3 weeks. I have the cash today. If I pay it now, I can stop thinking about it, whether or not I'll have the money. But I don't know what my husband's paycheck's going to look like in 3 weeks. And if it's low, I'm going to have to borrow from my sister, and I hate borrowing from my sister. And so what's going on here, right? Jeremy works full-time, and he has a 40-hour-a-week job with longevity and stability. But what he does is he's a truck mechanic. He fixes long-haul trucks. So what's going on is that he gets paid based on how many trucks he fixes. He gets paid on commission. And so even though he shows up 40 hours a week, his paycheck goes up and down. And for him, there's seasonality in it. Trucks break down more in the summer and in the winter than they do in the fall and the spring. This was in October. Becky didn't know if they were yet in the low period. And that story shows up over and over again in different ways. So I could have just as easily told you about Sandra, who's a tax preparer in Brooklyn. I could have told you about the Husseins, who are driving taxis in New York, right? Over and over, we saw this story. And what emerges in the data is extraordinary volatility in people's income. So the way we counted that was we looked at how many months in the year somebody's income was 25% or more higher than their average, and 25% or more lower than the average. So we were counting the spikes and the dips. And what we saw was that on average, families experienced about 5 months in our 12-month period where their income was either 25% or was outside of that plus or minus 25% range. And I trip over the language a little bit because it's not that they were 25% higher or lower. We use that benchmark because in other research that's been done about volatility year over year, economists have been using 25 plus or minus. And we wanted to see how our results matched up to theirs, because volatility year over year has been growing extraordinarily in the US over the last several decades. But when we actually look at what those spikes and dips are, on average, they're 50% higher or lower than the average. So really extreme swings from paycheck to paycheck. And what's going on, like what's driving this is a huge shift in the job market, in the labor market. So people talk a lot about the gig economy. They talk in the US all about the loss of manufacturing, the rise of automation. Is it about globalization? Like, without debating any of the causes, what is happening in the US is a hollowing out of the job market. Fewer middle income, middle skill jobs, more lower income, lower skill jobs, and more higher income, higher skill jobs. And one of the results of that is volatility. The other thing that's going on, there are two other huge trends that are driving economic fragility for American families. One is the rising cost of living relative to earnings. So earnings in the US have been stagnant for several decades on a real basis, but the cost of housing, the cost of transportation, the cost of education, the cost of healthcare have all been going up. And simultaneously, we've had what a social science researcher named Jacob Hacker, who's at Yale, has described as the great risk shift. So institutions, whether they are governments, whether you think of institutions as government or employers or insurance companies or large community-based organizations like hospitals, what they have all been doing in different ways is de-risking themselves and pushing that risk onto individuals. So in the US, this most clearly comes up when you think about a shift from pensions as a way of funding retirement to 401ks as a way of shifting paying for retirement, where we're expecting people to save for themselves and bear all the risk of ups and downs in the stock market over their working life versus guaranteeing a set income. And so the way that materializes for a family like Becky and Jeremy, or for the families in our households, is that they are on a regular basis kind of managing the ups and downs of their earnings relative to the ups and downs of their spending. Because it turned out that when we looked at the spending data, it was just as volatile as the earnings data. And this was a huge, huge surprise for my co-author because he's an economist, and in addition to sort of innovating the life cycle arc way of thinking about the world, economists think a lot about smoothing. Like they assume, right, the model is that you're going to smooth your spending over time. But we all know, right, that in reality, spending is very up and down. Like, you have Christmas, you have the beginning of the school year, you have a leak in your roof, you have whatever, right? The stuff comes up. And so, because earnings haven't kept pace with the cost of living, and because people bear a lot of this risk themselves, what happens is that people have a very small cushion between what they earn and what they spend. And so they're constantly managing this, what we came to think of as a mismatch. So what do Becky and Jeremy do about it? they do some amazing things, right? So one thing Becky does is she stockpiles. Her freezer is completely full. Her pantry is completely full. She says, I will never have to buy toothpaste again. And what's happening is that when Jeremy's earnings are high, or when there's a good deal, or hopefully both, she stocks up. And she said she was totally self-aware about this. She said, it is just easier to save in stuff than have money in the bank. She said, cash in the bank, too easy to spend. She literally said, you cannot buy movie tickets with a pork chop, right? So, this is a clear strategy for her. The other thing she does is she grabs spikes. So they over-withhold on their taxes in order to maximize the tax refund. And because a lump sum of money, a lump chunk of money, operates differently in your life than a slightly higher income all the time. And this is how I'm spending my time now in 2018, is thinking a lot about how those lump sums of money could be useful to people. And it is constantly a question, like, shouldn't you just raise people's incomes? Like when I show you that chart of the income versus spending and how it's mismatch, it is reasonable to think, well, if we raise people's incomes, you could get rid of that. And there's some truth to that, and I am in favor of everything we do to raise working people's incomes. At the same time, when we've done national studies of volatility in the US with people of all incomes, what you see is that there are still spikes and dips, and that a lump sum of money still functions differently in somebody's life than simply having higher income. They both matter, is really what we're trying to say. So people have strategies, right? Really good ones, but they don't always work. So what goes wrong? In our sample, what goes wrong is people are late on bills, people are late on their rent, people are threatened, people have overdraft, right? So it's expensive. And the tools people have to manage the ups and downs in their lives are insufficient. And that's why we're all spending time thinking about safe and affordable financial services. What could you create that would mimic Becky's strategy of stockpiling, but somehow be easier than that strategy, or more secure than that strategy? I don't really want to think about how her power going out would affect that strategy for her, right? There's risk in the strategies people take on themselves. So as creative as they are, as resourceful as they are, as inspiring as they are, they don't always work. And we want to help people, bolster people as much as possible so that their strategies they take on can be effective. And the way we came to think about this is that there's really a hidden inequality, is that we're all rightfully aware of income inequality, we're aware of wealth inequality, but there's also an inequality in access to steadiness, to security, to the feeling of like an ongoing stability in your financial life. And you could think of it as that, that upper right corner where we're trying to get people to go, where they're financially okay in some way, right? However they define it, or however you define it, when you talk about financial well-being, right? That okay is financial well-being. We're trying to get people there. And there's really two ways you could go about that. You can figure out how to get people steadier income, steadier spending patterns, right? So in the US, we're increasingly having talks about scheduling and how do you get people steadier pay and steadier work. But you can also think about, right, so that's moving people up on the vertical axis. You could also think about the tools that get people over to the right, right? Better savings tool, better borrowing tools, better lending tools. So I'm not going to tell more stories about the individual people. There's a session on income volatility tomorrow where we'll be able to dive deeper into how this functions in people's lives. Where I want to land us really is on the idea that a lot of what people are aiming for in these strategies are increased control. So they're not necessarily looking for the whole problem to be taken off their plate and put elsewhere. They're looking to be able to touch and feel it and manage it in ways that really work for them. If we're going to be able to do that for them, we have to see three things really clearly. One is that we have to see that people's ongoing cash flows, the ups and downs of their financial lives, they matter alongside income strategies and wealth building strategies. And we have to see that getting access to the right money at the right time is a big piece of that. And so helping people to smooth out, to be able to spend when they need to spend, regardless of when the income comes in, is a big and important project. And to underscore that, the way that Jeremy and Becky ultimately chose to manage this for themselves is that Jeremy switched to a different job. And in this job, he earns less than he did before on an annual basis. He has a longer commute. So it's tougher in a lot of ways. But he also earns a steady weekly paycheck, regardless of how many trucks he fixes. So for him, that trade-off was worthwhile. But I would argue we don't really want people to have to make that trade-off. We want people to be able to aim for mobility, aim for earning more if that's what their objective is, and not have to feel like stability is a trade-off between opportunity and stability. But in order to do that, we're going to have to move risk in some ways, right? We need to be able to create some supports for Becky and Jeremy so that they're not managing those ups and downs entirely on their own. So thank you again for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to have you come and seat with us, if that's okay.
I'm on autopilot.
We're all going to have a seat. All right. Thank you so much, Rachel. I just love hearing about this research every time, and hearing the stories of people like Becky and Jeremy. It just brings everything to life for us and just shows us the reality of struggling with these low and unpredictable incomes. So thank you. Now I want to turn over to Judy, who's going to, there we go. So Judy, it's so great to have you with us here today. Your organization, Acorn, spends a lot of time talking door to door with low-income families to understand their daily challenges. And I would love for you to tell us more about the types of issues you've been hearing about. Are they similar to what Rachel uncovered in her Financial Diaries research?
Thanks, and thanks for having me today. The short answer is yes. What we've been talking about is exactly the type of issue that we hear when we're door knocking. I'll just quickly give a summary about what Acorn is for people in the crowd who don't know us well. We're a membership-based, not-for-profit, where we spend most of our resources going door-to-door in low and moderate income neighborhoods. And we have offices in Vancouver, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, and Halifax. And over the course of a year, we talk to about 8,000 people who want to get involved with our organization in some capacity. We probably knock on around 50,000 doors. And we do about 400 small, medium, and large-sized meetings a year with our membership and community members. And about 5,000 people come out to our meetings and events. Often the same person is coming out to multiple meetings and events. But what we're doing when we're talking with people are, brainstorming what their issues are and then what they see as the solutions and how to make the changes in their lives that they want to see. And, housing is a huge issue. The price of housing and standards around housing is a big issue. And another big issue is, what we call financial justice, a campaign that we've been running around fair banking, because many of our members, probably about 85% of them are renters, maybe 15% own condos or homes. But the issues that they bring up around financial justice and managing their finances are very similar to what we've been hearing here today. We come at it from a different perspective in that our members when you're on that cushion, things are there's a lot of unknowns in your life around employment or unexpected things that might happen, like a flat tire. And, our people need to decide whether do you pay the rent, do you pay your internet bill, do you pay your phone bill, or do you feed the kids? And, people make decisions that are best suited to their family. And in that situation, people are going to usually feed the kids, right? And so what happens in that situation is that, their bills are outstanding. And then there's a bunch of financial implications for not paying your bills that kind of entrench you a bit deeper into potentially like a credit spiral. So, we see that there's a close relationship between many of our members have points in their year where they go into crisis. And, if you have money, you spend your way out of crisis, right? You're having, you need to fix a flat tire. Well, you call a cab, you get your tire fixed. But if you're on the margins, what do you do? And so if you choose to not pay your bills, then your credit rating goes down. And our members have a term where they call it's expensive to be poor, because the worse your credit is, the more expensive it is to access money to deal with any unknown with your income or with something unexpected in your life. And so another option that people may turn to is to make sure that all their bills are paid or their kids get fed. They will turn to fringe financial institutions like payday lenders and growing installment lenders, which we see as a growing field out there in our neighborhoods around being marketed to our members, which if people get into a debt trap within payday lending, in particular, you get, with a payback in 2 weeks, which is the period in most provinces, you get into a vicious debt cycle where you just start giving up things. First your phone bill, your internet, and eventually people stop paying their rent. And it's a very vicious debt cycle. So how we operate is we have a number of campaigns that we run around trying to regulate the predatory lending industry municipally, provincially, and we'd like to see some solutions coming out federally. And it's funny that you're talking about the game of life. About 8 years ago in Toronto, the United Way asked me to do workshops with the business community around fringe financial institutions, and I was like, oh, how do we do this? So I created this little game, I called the game of life, but then I predetermined what everybody's credit was. So some people had zero access to credit, some people had access to maybe a line of credit, and then I unfolded all different scenarios that they would get. And the people who had no access to credit and were forced into getting a loan from a payday lender were always really upset at the end of the game, because it's an emotional, even just in a game scenario, when you can't spend your way out of a problem and then you get kicked out of the game. In a real life scenario, what people go through in our neighborhoods is really it's life altering. And the solutions that the people in this room can come up with are great, and I look forward to talking with all of you. That's maybe my 5 minutes, so I'll hand it back to you guys.
Thank you so much, Judy. And I love that quote you shared with us. It's expensive to be poor, absolutely. So thanks for that, and thanks for all the great work you guys do out in the community. I want to turn it over to Jerry next. And so, Jerry, every time, just want to make sure I have the right slide up. Okay, I must have. So, Jerry, every time here in Canada we talk about the U.S. financial diaries, I get these looks of, okay, great, but what about here? We have all this great data from the U.S., which we're so excited about hearing about, but what's happening here? And you're potentially you're going to be our solution to this problem. So we're so excited to have you. And I think with a few other researchers, you're working on an innovative research project to essentially have some Canadian financial diaries. So we'd love to hear more about that project and how that's going.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elodie, and very nice to meet you, Rachel, and thank you, Judy. And yeah, actually, the Canadian Financial Diaries research project is just getting started. We're beginning phase 1, but really the story of the Financial Diaries here in Canada has come from ABLE, because it was a group of academics that have been regularly meeting at ABLE that got it going. So it was Gail Henderson, who I see, Jennifer Robson, I haven't seen her yet, David Rothwell, and Louise Mbandumwe. So we had been talking about doing some research for quite a while through ABLE, and then finally, just about 2 years ago, we successfully got a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So we're really thrilled to be starting phase 1. And so just by way of background, in Canada, we really don't have very good statistics, analysis of the financial lives of vulnerable Canadians or low-income Canadians. We have national surveys. The difficulty with national surveys is they're a point in time. We really don't get the kind of granular analysis that Rachel was sharing with us from the US Diary. So that's a real gap. The other thing that national surveys typically don't provide is insights on the lives of low-income Canadians. They often get sort of bypassed from those kinds of surveys. And finally, there is really a gap in understanding causation. And I thank Liz Mulholland at Prosper for pointing out the importance of the diaries, that really through the diaries and walking with people in their financial lives, that we can understand, well, what's causing this, whether it's an improvement or a deterioration. So in order to make good policies and practices, we are hoping that the financial diaries will provide more depth and more insight to inform those practices. And so the diaries, just want to share 3 aspects of the diaries in Canada. So the core feature of the diaries is that it's a quantitative and qualitative data collection process. So we're working with 120 Canadians over 2 phases. So phase 1, like I said, is just starting. We plan to have 50 participants. Phase 2 will start in a year and a half or so. We'll learn from phase 1 when we start phase 2, and we've got some other features in phase 2 that will be innovative. But the idea is that to track people's finances, for sure in depth through weekly meetings, but also to get have them to share with us about their financial lives. Like, what are their ups and downs? What's working for them? What's not working for them? So we want it to be very interactive. A second feature of the diaries is that we want to have sort of modules in the process. And by modules, what I mean is we want to look at specific topics. So my colleague Gail Henderson is a law professor, and she's very interested to understand to what extent folks who sign, for instance, payday loan contracts or bank account contracts, to what extent do they read them? Do they understand them? And so we're going to have that as sort of a module. So when our participants are doing those kinds of things, we're going to have a series of interviews with them about that. Another thing we want to look at is intra-household finances, how that works. Is it harmonious? Is it conflictual? Like, how do people negotiate their finances, especially when they're tough? So that's kind of the module idea. And then the last point I wanted to mention is a key feature, because this has come from ABLE, a key feature is that we want to have strong relationships with ABLE. ABLE is an awesome organization with practitioners and policymakers. We want to hear from you about how we can do this better, and we also want to share our results. And in fact, we want to have dialogue between our diary participants and practitioners and policymakers. So that's another feature that's really important. One last comment. Thinking about, oh dear, my alarm is ringing, sorry. Elder James had so many wonderful comments earlier, and I just wanted to connect with one of the points he mentioned about generosity. And I was actually blown away. We were recruiting participants through the Norquay Building Tax Clinic in Winnipeg. And I was chatting with an older woman, and we were just talking about the diaries and stuff. And then she went and sat down, and I went and did some other stuff. She came over to me later, and she gave me a toonie, which, by the way, I tried to resist, but she was very insistent. She said, go and buy yourself a coffee. And I just thought, wow, that is such an expression. This was a low-income tax clinic, so everyone there has low income, such an expression of generosity. So we're already learning some very interesting stuff just in the recruitment process. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And as I was saying, we're all so thrilled that this research is coming and that you're looking for that feedback and that back and forth with practitioners. And just a plug, so tomorrow at the marketplace session, if you're interested in hearing more, diving deeper into Jerry's research, you're actually going to be able to join him for a discussion. So if that's something you're interested in, keep that in mind for tomorrow's marketplace session. We're going to turn it over to you now to ask questions to our panelists. So we have a couple people with mics in the audience. So if you have a question, just put your hand up and they will bring the mic over to you. As you're thinking, I'm going to give another plug, which is, unfortunately, we're running a little behind today, so the Q&A period is going to feel a little bit rushed. We probably have time for only a few questions. But if you want to dive deeper into this topic of income volatility, right after the break, there's going to be a breakout session on income volatility. So if that's something you're interested in hearing more about, thinking more about, you should really go to that session. Okay, any questions? Right here at the front.
Thank you, everybody. It's great information. I was just curious, for Judy, from Acorn perspective, when you go door to door, we're doing some work in community neighborhoods. There are some groups going door to door, and we struggle with what to ask around financial questions. So financial empowerment related questions. Can you share with us some of what your questions look like, or how you approach people door to door?
Yeah, I mean, when we go door to door, it's pretty broad. Hi, my name is Judy. I'm working with a group of neighbors that are coming together to make some changes. We've been talking to people in your building who are concerned about cockroaches, high bank fees, that lot down the street has garbage in it. Is there anything you want to talk about? And then we asked to go in, and then we asked people, if you could change one thing, and so that we keep the conversation very broad and about what people want to focus on. And then from there, we, ask them what they see as the solution, and then, we talk about, coming together as a group to make the changes. And then from that, then we dig a bit deeper, and we have chapter meetings, and it's often in the community meetings afterwards where we'll talk a little bit more deeply about kind of common themes that we're hearing. We do a whole organizing drive process that takes 2 months, where we do a series of 4 meetings, brainstorming issues and stuff. So the outcome may not be financial justice or inclusion, but because it's something that our members always bring up, it is sometimes we'll have specialized meetings to talk about that issue area. But I'm happy to follow up.
I scared all of you away by saying we're late. We have time for more questions. Liz, at the front.
Just going to wait for the breakout, but since we're here.
Thanks, Adam. Just because now's the time to confess, we get a lot of great ideas from the United States, and we dust them off and tart them up and call them Canadian in financial empowerment, just because you guys are a few years ahead of us. So, Rachel, can you tell me where the kind of research and the folks who've been working around this income volatility issue, where their thinking is going and what you guys are focusing on next, and kind of what's the next frontier, just so we can start to think ourselves and maybe start to close that time lag between your work and our work. Jerry's now forging ahead, but we're sort of just giving thought to what comes next after that.
Sure, and I think that was very generous framing about U.S. versus Canada. Probably undeserved. Definitely undeserved. Yes, exactly. Not more broadly. Yeah, I think good. I feel like it's really important to draw a very discrete circle around that statement. Yeah. So yeah, as I watched how you all were moderating this morning, I kept thinking how ahead Canada is on the conversation about so many different things. Even the fact that you have a breakout room for introverts, just in case you need some quiet, to me felt very innovative. So yeah, we put out initial work around volatility in 2014, and what was great about that is it did inspire a lot of take-up by others. So the Federal Reserve is now, they've introduced a few questions in their annual benchmarking surveys. So to Jerry's point, like annual benchmarking surveys can't give you the depth that the diaries will give you, but they do allow you to get important point-in-time information, and the FDIC and Federal Reserve have regular studies, which I'm sure you have as well, that they've now introduced some questions around volatility and some questions around how volatility then impacts your life. So that's one really important direction to take this work. The other important thing is to be able to gather information over time. The other thing is that the JP Morgan Chase Institute has done a whole series of follow-on studies where they've looked at how volatility then connects with spending. So the most interesting thing, one of them, they've put out a ton of interesting things, but the thing that stuck with me a lot lately is they've done some studies around how ups and downs in income affect ups and downs in healthcare spending. So they're looking at like what are the follow-on effects, and what they're seeing is that in the US people do postpone medical care until they have income spikes. And so I don't think that's going to translate here, because one of the places you're far ahead of us is in your healthcare system. But there must be something else, right? Something else where you try and understand what are the, like in Jerry's, like in the initial diary study, you're going to surface some things about financial lives, but you're not going to be able to get the full, okay, we now know this, so what does that mean about this other thing? And the follow-on studies will be able to get there. And I think, and then the other place where I don't think it's about being ahead or behind, it's just the natural flow of it, is that because you already have this community, right, this tremendous financial empowerment community thinking about financial well-being, you're already doing the same thing we are, which is what does this mean for the financial services that people need, or financial education, or connection to each other. These issues around community that Jerry's talking about are huge. And for me, one of the things that was interesting about the diaries is that in the US anyway, we had kind of a conceptual divide between community development work, which was about communities and places, and financial inclusion work, which was really anchored on individuals. But I'm now back to the community focus, because as soon as you start looking at people's individual financial lives, you find out they are intertwined. It's a web where people give and save and borrow and share resources so much that I'm now convinced that the strategies that are most likely to have high impact have to tackle a community, because even if you help one person, one family with their financial lives, if their cousins and neighbors are still struggling, they won't actually break free of those struggles, because they'll help, because they should help, because we're generous. So it's right and appropriate and human nature, and also like has to be folded into our strategies.
Thank you so much. I think this is probably a great note to end on. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions. So please join me in thanking Jerry, Judy, and Rachel in joining us today.